Ilara did not go to town for people. She went for salt and wire and the other necessities required to maintain the deep, profound silence of her life. For 5 years, since the fever had taken John and the tiny, unnamed child he had never seen, silence had been her only crop. It grew in the fallow fields and settled like dust on the furniture in her cabin. It was a shroud she wore willingly. The town of Redemption was a place of noise, a jarring symphony of hammers on anvils, drunken laughter, and the grating pleas of the desperate. She endured it, her face a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on the list in her mind. But today, the noise was different. It was thicker, curdled with a particular kind of cruelty. A crowd was gathered in the main square, a sweaty, jostling ring around a makeshift auction block. On the block stood Silas Blackwood, a man whose wealth was built on the misfortunes of others, his shadow stretching long and greedy in the afternoon sun. He was selling people. Families displaced by the drought, debtors, orphans. It was a grim spectacle Ilara had learned to walk past, her gaze averted, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. She loaded her wagon, the salt sack landing with a heavy thud, and prepared to leave. Then she heard the auctioneer's sneering voice rise above the din. And now, a special lot. A bargain for any man with patience and a strong roof. 3 women were shoved forward, stumbling into the harsh light. Sisters, it was plain to see. They huddled together, a small island of shared terror in a sea of leering faces. All 3 were pregnant, their conditions obvious beneath their worn, thin dresses. The eldest, Anya, met the crowd's gaze with a spark of doomed defiance. The middle one, Lena, trembled, her hand pressed against her belly as if to shield the life within from the world's ugliness. The youngest, Sophia, seemed to have retreated entirely, her eyes vacant and fixed on the splintered wood of the platform. 3 for the price of 1, the auctioneer bellowed. Bit of a wait, but think of the return. A ready-made workforce. A few cruel chuckles rippled through the crowd, but no one bid. The men saw liabilities. They saw mouths to feed, complications, burdens. Blackwood's face soured. He hated being made to look a fool. Useless, he muttered, loud enough for all to hear. If no one takes this sorry lot, they'll go to the silver mines. We'll work the trouble out of them there. A collective gasp went through the few women in the crowd. The mines were a death sentence for a strong man, let alone pregnant women. It was then that the stone in Ilara's chest cracked. A hot, agonizing pain shot through her, a memory of a cradle she had sanded smooth with her own hands, a room that had waited in joyful silence for a cry that never came. The silence of her homestead suddenly seemed not like peace, but like a tomb. She felt the weight of her husband's gold coins in the pouch at her belt, a dead weight she had guarded for a future that had died with him. Before she understood what she was doing, her feet were moving. The crowd parted for her, their faces a mixture of pity and confusion. She stopped before the block and looked up, not at the sisters, but directly into the cold, calculating eyes of Silas Blackwood. Her voice, rough from years of disuse, cut through the air like a shard of glass. I will take them. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You, widow. She untied the heavy pouch from her belt and threw it onto the platform. It landed with a solid, definitive thud. That is everything I have, she said. It was the price of her land, the price of her past, the price of her grief. It was the price of a sound other than silence. The journey home was a long, slow procession measured in the creak of wagon wheels and the soft scuff of boots in the dust. Ilara drove the horse, her back ramrod straight, while the 3 sisters walked behind, their silence a different vintage from her own. Hers was a hardened choice, theirs was the fragile, terrified silence of the prey. Blackwood's final words echoed in the dry air. You've bought yourself a bushel of trouble, widow. They are property. Remember that it was not advice, it was a threat, a promise of future claim. Ilara had ignored him, her focus singular, getting them away. Now, in the vast, empty expanse of the plains, the weight of her decision settled upon her. She had not simply spent her money, she had shattered the careful, sterile peace she had cultivated for 5 years. She risked a glance at the small, cracked mirror she kept tied to the wagon frame. In it, she saw them. Anya, her defiant gaze now turned inward, scanning the horizon with a hawk's vigilance. Lena, her steps faltering, her hand never leaving her swollen belly. Sophia, a ghost drifting in their wake, her eyes still lost. They were so young, their faces smudged with dirt and fear. An unfamiliar and unwelcome instinct stirred in Ilara's chest, a dull ache she recognized as the phantom limb of motherhood. That night, they made a small, nervous camp. Ilara built a fire, its flames pushing back the immense darkness that pressed in from all sides. The sisters huddled together on the far side of the fire, whispering in a soft, melodic tongue she did not understand. They shared a single biscuit between them, breaking it into 3 precise pieces. Ilara sat apart, the heavy rifle across her lap, her eyes scanning the blackness not for coyotes, but for the 2-legged predators she knew followed men like Blackwood. As the night wore on, Sophia began to cough, a dry, racking sound that shook her small frame. She stumbled when she tried to rise for a drink of water. Without thinking, moved by an impulse she hadn't felt in an eternity, Ilara reached out and steadied her, her calloused hand closing around the girl's thin arm. The contact was like a jolt of lightning. Sophia flinched, her eyes wide with fear, and Ilara pulled her hand back as if burned. It was the first time she had willingly touched another human being since she had held John's cold hand and whispered goodbye. 2 days later, the homestead came into view. It was not a welcoming sight. A sturdy log cabin, a well-built barn, and a neatly fenced yard, but it was stark, isolated, a solitary scar on the barren land. And in the yard, under the lonely shadow of a cottonwood tree, was a single grave marked by a weathered wooden cross. As the wagon rolled to a stop, the sisters saw it. Their hushed whispering ceased. They looked from the grave to Ilara's impassive face, and a new fear, colder and more profound than the fear of the auction block, settled over them. They had been bought by a woman who lived alone with her dead. The hope that had flickered to life in the town square was extinguished by the profound, crushing silence of their new home. They had traded one prison for another. Life settled into a routine of unspoken rules and shared space. The air inside the cabin was thick with caution. Ilara gave the sisters the main room, with its 2 beds and patchwork quilts, while she took a small cot by the stone hearth, a sentinel in her own home. She was a creature of efficiency, her movements precise and without wasted energy. She showed them how to draw water from the well without fouling it, how to scatter grain for the chickens, how to bank the fire at night so a few coals remained by morning. Her instructions were brief, declarative sentences, delivered without warmth but also without cruelty. The wood is stacked here, the pump needs to be primed, we eat when the sun is high. The sisters were quick learners, their hands, though soft, accustomed to work. They moved with a quiet, synchronized grace, a dance of survival perfected over a lifetime of relying on one another. They washed their clothes in a tub behind the cabin, their low murmurs the only sound to challenge the ceaseless wind. The emotional chasm between them and Ilara felt as wide and desolate as the plains outside. One evening, as Ilara was mending a harness by the firelight, Anya, the eldest, finally broke the suffocating quiet. She stood before Ilara, her arms crossed, her chin lifted. "Why?" she asked. The single word hung in the air, heavy with accusation and fear. "Why did you buy us?" Ilara did not look up from her work. The needle pushed through the thick leather. A long moment passed, stretched taut by the crackle of the fire. She thought of the empty cradle, of the echoing silence, of the sudden, inexplicable crack in her soul. But these were not words she could speak. They were wounds too old and deep to be exposed to the air. Finally, she stopped her work and met Anya's gaze. "I know what it is to have nothing left," she said, her voice a low rasp. It was not the whole truth, but it was a piece of it, a shard offered in place of an explanation. It did not satisfy Anya, but it shifted something in the room. A few days later, a new sound entered the cabin. Lena, while kneading dough for bread, began to hum. It was a soft, sad lullaby from her homeland, a melody of grief and hope intertwined. The sound washed over Ilara, and she froze, her hand hovering over the vegetables she was chopping. It was a sound of life, of continuity, a painful and beautiful reminder of everything she had lost. She didn't tell Lena to stop. The next morning, she saw Sophia out by the lone grave. The young girl was carefully placing a small, defiant cluster of purple wildflowers at the base of the wooden cross. Ilara watched from the cabin window, a fist tightening over her heart. The fallow garden behind the cabin became a silent battleground of wills. It was a plot of earth John had tilled, where they had planned to grow beans and squash for a family that never came to be. Ilara had let it go to weeds, unable to bear the sight of it. One afternoon, the sisters stood by its edge, looking at the dry, cracked soil. It was Lena who spoke, her voice timid. "If we may," she said, gesturing to the plot. "We could plant something." For the winter, Ilara hesitated. To break that ground felt like a betrayal, like admitting that life could, and would, go on. But then she looked at their three faces, at the nascent lives they carried, and gave a single, curt nod. The next day, the four of them worked side by side, turning the soil, pulling the weeds. Their hands in the same earth, they began, wordlessly, to cultivate something more than a garden. That night, the sky turned a bruised purple, and a great storm rolled in off the plains. The wind howled like a grieving beast, and rain lashed against the windows. Amidst the fury of the storm, Lena cried out, a sharp, sudden sound of pain. Her water had broken. Panic flared in Anya's and Sophia's eyes. But as the storm raged outside, something within Ilara became preternaturally calm. The stoic, grieving widow vanished, replaced by a woman of immense, formidable competence. Her voice was steady, a lighthouse in their fear. Anya, fetch the clean linens from the chest. Sophia, put more water on the fire to boil. Now the skills she had learned for a life she never got to live, the ones she thought were buried with her heart, came rushing back with startling clarity. In the heart of the tempest, she became their anchor, their protector, their fierce, unyielding hope. The storm broke with the dawn, leaving the world washed clean and glistening. Inside the cabin, a new sound had joined the symphony of the wind and the crackling fire, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn. Lena lay exhausted but radiant in one of the beds, a tiny, dark-haired baby boy cradled in her arms. The birth had been long and difficult, but Ilara had guided them through it with a midwife's steady hands and a general's calm command. The arrival of the child transformed the very air in the cabin. The last vestiges of fear and suspicion among the sisters had been washed away in the crucible of labor, replaced by a fierce, shared gratitude. They were no longer a widow and her purchased wards. They were a family. Anya looked at Ilara with a new reverence. Sophia's shy smile was now open and frequent, and Lena had named the baby Jonan, a name that sounded so much like John that it made Ilara's heart ache with a bittersweet joy. She found herself smiling as she watched Sophia rock the baby, a strange, rusty sensation on her face. Life had returned to the homestead. Outside, the first green shoots were pushing their way through the dark soil of the garden. Hope was no longer a dangerous illusion, it was a tangible thing, as real as the tiny infant sleeping by the hearth. The peace, however, was as fragile as a new leaf. A week later, Ilara was chopping wood when her dog, a scruffy mutt named Ghost, let out a low growl, the hair on his back rigid. Ilara stilled, her hand resting on the axe handle. On the distant horizon, a rider was approaching, a dark speck against the endless blue sky. It was not a neighbor. No one ever came this way. Her stomach clenched into a cold knot. It was one of Blackwood's men. He rode with an arrogant slouch, reining his horse in just outside the fence as if the ground within was beneath him. He did not dismount. "Blackwood sent me," he called out, his voice laced with contempt. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He says the deal's off. Says you bought 3, not for inch." His eyes flickered toward the cabin, where the faint sound of Jonan's crying could be heard. "He considers the new arrival his property. An undeclared asset. He's coming to collect what's his." At sunrise tomorrow the threat was absolute, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man assured of his power. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread hanging in the air. Fear, cold and familiar, crept back into the cabin. Anya's face went pale. Lena clutched her baby tighter, a shield of bone and flesh. They all looked to Ilara, their newfound hope flickering like a candle in a gale. But the woman they looked to was not the same one who had left redemption weeks ago. The grief that had hollowed her out had been replaced by a ferocious, protective fire. This was not a fight over property. This was a defense of her home. Her family. Her purpose. "He is not taking this child," Ilara said, and her voice held the unyielding certainty of bedrock. That evening, she did not mend or cook. She prepared for war. She barred the heavy plank door and shuttered the windows. She took down John's old shotgun from its pegs over the mantelpiece, its steel cool and solid in her hands. She checked the action on her rifle. She laid out the ammunition on the table. "Get in the root cellar," she told the sisters, her voice low and firm. "Take the baby, and stay there until I come for you." Anya, her face set like stone, picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth. "No," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "We were sold because we were alone. We are not alone anymore. We stay with you." Sophia stood beside her, brandishing a heavy cast-iron skillet, her small frame radiating a courage Ilara had never seen. Lena, holding Jonan, moved to stand behind them, her presence a silent vow. Ilara looked at them, these three women and a tiny child, ready to stand against a coming evil, and her heart swelled with a fierce, burning pride. The long, tense night began, a vigil kept against the encroaching darkness. Dawn arrived not as a promise, but as a threat. Its pale, grey light crept over the horizon, illuminating the 6 figures on horseback. Silas Blackwood sat on his fine black mare in the center, flanked by 5 grim-faced men, their shapes dark and menacing against the rising sun. They moved slowly, deliberately, their confidence a palpable thing. They surrounded the small cabin, trapping it in a ring of malice. "Widow!" Blackwood's voice boomed, sharp and imperious. "Send them out! Send out my property! Don't be a fool! This is business, not a personal matter. They are not worth your life." The cabin door opened. Ilara stepped out onto the porch alone, the morning light glinting off the twin barrels of the shotgun she held. Her face was calm, her body rooted to the spot. She had spent 5 years dying a slow death. She would not die afraid. "You are on my land, Silas," she called back, her voice clear and carrying, stripped of all fear. "And these women are my family. You will not touch them." Blackwood let out a short, incredulous laugh. He was a man who understood only currency and force, and he could not comprehend the value of what he was seeing. "So be it," he sneered, and gestured with his chin. "Get them." 2 of his men dismounted and rushed the porch. The world narrowed for Ilara into a space of a few yards. The first man was close, his face a snarl of cruel intent. The shotgun bucked against her shoulder, its roar shattering the morning quiet. The man was thrown backward, a stunned look on his face, before he collapsed in the dust. The second man hesitated, faltering at the sudden, shocking violence. It gave Ilara the single second she needed. She dropped the shotgun, her hand already moving to the pistol tucked in her belt. The shot was not as loud, but just as final. The man cried out and clutched his leg, falling to his knees. The fight was not a grand battle, it was a desperate, brutal, and swift defense of a sanctuary. It was the violent punctuation to a long sentence of grief. From behind the door, Anya stood with the iron poker held high, ready to defend the threshold. The remaining men looked from their fallen comrades to the lone woman on the porch, bleeding from a gash on her forehead where a stray rock had struck, yet still standing. They saw not a grieving widow, but something primal and terrifying. Blackwood stared, his greedy calculus failing him. He was a bully who paid others to fight his battles, not a warrior himself. His entitlement warred with his cowardice. He saw the bodies, he saw the unyielding woman, and he saw the potential for legal trouble he couldn't easily buy his way out of. With a string of vile curses, he yanked on his horse's reins. "This isn't over, you mad witch," he snarled, but his words were hollow. He and his remaining men turned and fled, their retreat a cloud of shame-filled dust. Ilara watched them go, her strength finally failing her. She slumped against the wooden doorframe, the pistol slipping from her numb fingers. The door flew open and the sisters were there, surrounding her, their hands reaching out to steady her. Anya gently wiped the blood from her brow. Sophia began to tend to her wound with a clean cloth, her touch no longer timid. Lena stood over them, holding Jonan, who had slept through the entire ordeal. In that moment, as the sun finally crested the horizon and bathed the homestead in a warm, golden light, the last of the ice around Ilara's heart broke and melted away. She looked at the small, green shoots in the garden, at the tiny, sturdy cabin that had become a fortress, at the faces of her family. She looked toward the single grave under the cartonwood, not with the familiar pang of loss, but with a quiet sense of peace. She had not honored John's memory by hoarding his gold, but by spending it on life itself. Lena carefully passed the sleeping baby into her arms. As Ilara held the small, warm weight against her chest, a single tear traced a path through the grime and blood on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of profound, painful, hard-won joy. The silence was gone forever, replaced by the sacred sound of a beating heart.